Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Thursday night, Yom Chamishi. Tomorrow's Friday, Yom Shishi. So Shabbos is almost here. Let's light up the darkness. And who is checking in today? Yehuda in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Clarice in El DF, Distrito Federal, Mexico City, Bill Eldridge in mid-Missouri, where the weather is made up and the seasons don't matter. Sheesh. I think there's a lot of places in the country that could say that now. We've never had so much rain in LA. Such a bracha, so much blessing. Paula in the Great Northwest, Glenn in West Palm Beach, Paula in Chicago, Sam in Virginia, Lucy in Minnesota, Shandora in the Bronx, Sharon in New Jersey, Renee in Indiana, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, Karen in Northern California, Guy in Ohio, Paul saying shalom from the frigid wilderness of Minneapolis. We are currently going through yet another snowstorm. Excuse me. I had a college friend from Minnesota who told me that there's only 2 seasons in Minneapolis. What was it? It's winter and road repair. L'chaim. Who else is with us? Paulus is gone tomorrow. I will watch later. Bill, you can keep it. Don't send it over the Rockies. We've had enough. Have a great boat. Cheap. I'm not getting the joke, but okay. Over there on the YouTube side, nobody checking in yet. Okay, everybody. Got a pretty interesting daf today. We are in Tractate Nazir, the 17th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of the oath of Naziris. We are in chapter 7, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 2, basically defining what creates impurity for the dead, right? So at Nazir, one of the promises that he makes, one of the obligations he has when he takes the oath of Naziris, is that during the term of his Naziris, no eating or drinking a produce of the grapevine, no cutting the hair or removing it in any way, and no becoming impure for the dead. The same kind of stringency that a high priest has. Any Jew can become a Nazir. While you're a Nazir, you cannot become impure for the dead, not even for your parents, although you do become impure for the Mace Mitzvah, to bury the unattended corpse. But if there's someone else that can take care of it, the Nazir does not enter the cemetery, does not come into contact with the corpse, doesn't walk over a corpse, doesn't occupy the same room where there is a corpse, must distance himself from the corpse in every form. And we've been getting into the nuances of what would bring about that corpse impurity and cause a Nazir to shave, meaning he'll have to bring the offerings of impurity that he's interrupted his Naziris by becoming impure for the dead. He's going to have to go through the purification, the 7-day purification of one who becomes impure for the dead. We can't do that anymore, only when the temple is standing. Go through the 7-day purification, bring the offerings of impurity, shave the head, and start the whole term of Naziris over. So it's what triggers that. So we continue at the bottom of page 51b. So in relation to the above discussion concerning a body that was missing a limb, and interestingly, we saw that if a body is missing a limb, whereas, for example, a regular priest, a Kohen, as opposed to a high priest, a Kohen Gadol, a Kohen is also prohibited to become impure for the dead, with the exception of close relatives. A regular Kohen does become impure to bury his father. But if the corpse of his father is missing a limb, that's considered an incomplete corpse, and he's not permitted to become impure for the dead in order to bury that particular corpse. He lets somebody else do the burying. He's going to mourn, obviously, for his father, but he doesn't do the act of burying and handling the corpse, etc. And so in some other rules also, we see that an incomplete corpse has a different law than a complete corpse. So continuing that, So Rava raised a dilemma. If someone eats an entire ant, even if it is less than an olive bulk in volume. Now, why are we talking about the laws of permitted and prohibited foods, right? This has nothing to do with a discussion that we've been talking about. That Jews don't eat pork, that Jews don't eat shellfish, that Jews don't eat creeping things. That's a completely separate body of law. But because we've been talking about the difference between a whole corpse and a partial corpse, this subject is going to, we're going to bring in this other law for comparison's sake. Right, so if someone eats an entire ant, even if it is less than an olive bulk in volume, he is liable for eating a creeping animal because it is a whole creature. Rava's dilemma was as follows. If one eats an ant that lacks a part, like for example, it's missing a leg, what is the law? Is this individual liable to receive lashes for eating creeping things, right? This would only be if he did it on purpose and he was warned not to do it and he did it anyway. So then what is the law? Is this individual liable to receive lashes? And the two possibilities are like this. Is it learned as a tradition that the amount for which one is liable is a whole ant, right? Because see, when you're talking about like, sort of like crushed up partial insects, right? A Jew is not allowed to eat that, but the minimum volume to trigger liability is an olive bulk or a lentil bulk or whatever it is, right? That minimum measure. However, if he eats even one ant, which its volume is smaller than that minimum measure, but it is a complete creature, boom, then that triggers the liability. So here we're talking about an ant that is incomplete because it was missing a leg. So does it count as a whole creature or not, right? So is it learned as a tradition that the amount for which one is liable is a whole ant and this one is lacking? Or did we learn that he is punished for a viable entity, and there is a viable entity here despite the missing limb? An ant missing one leg is still a living, viable creature. Now we're in 52a. So Rav Yehuda from Diskarta said, come and hear the following halachic midrash. A midrash is a kind of, often they're brought down to sort of like tell a story that the sages created to illustrate a deeper truth. But a midrash doesn't necessarily have to be a story. A midrash is a halachic discourse that can include stories from the sages. It's another area of the oral tradition. It's not the Talmud, it's the midrash. Right? So enough said about that. So one might have thought, come and hear the following halachic midrash concerning the ritual impurity of creeping animals. And the verse states, whoever touches them when they are dead shall be impure. Right? Now this is about creeping things when they are dead. Right? When they are dead, they impart tuma. A person becomes ritually impure. It's not the extreme tuma, the extreme ritual impurity of touching a human corpse, which requires a 7-day purification. But if you come into contact with a dead creeping thing, I'm not sure what the purification is, probably immerse in the mikveh and wait till nightfall and you're done. So whoever touches them when they are dead shall be impure. That law is Leviticus 11:31. Now one might have thought that this law applies only to all of them, meaning complete creatures. Therefore, the verse states, and upon whatever any of them, when they are dead, fall, it shall be impure, which indicates that part of these creatures also imparts impurity. If the law were derived solely from the phrase of them, one might have thought that it applies only to a small part of them. The verse therefore states them, which means all of them. Now, when we're talking about dead creeping things, right, that they impart impurity, like that whole story, the oven of Achnai, where Rabbi Eliezer was having a heated debate with the majority, with the rest of the sages. It was concerning when a dead creeping thing, right, like a dead insect, a dead mouse, falls into a clay oven, and then it renders that clay vessel impure, and it cannot be purified. So the oven has to be smashed, and the poor person has to get another oven, right? In the old days, clay ovens were the kinds of ovens that they had. The oven of Achnai was that new technology where it was made out of rings of clay separated by some kind of adhesive, so it wasn't really a clay vessel, according to Rabbi Eliezer. The majority overruled him, but that debate was about a dead creeping thing falling into a clay vessel and rendering it impure, similar to what we're talking about here. Now, how so? How can one reconcile the two verses? He does not become ritually impure unless he touches at least part of them that is equal in measure to all of them, meaning a large part of the creeping thing. And the sages calculated that this is the volume of a lentil bulk. Why is this? As the start of the formation of a skink, there's an animal you don't talk about very often, as the start of the formation of a skink, one of the 8 impure creeping animals, is the size of a lentil bulk. And this includes the halachic midrash. With regard to the issue at hand, one can learn from here that it is learned as a tradition that the amount for a creature to be considered whole is a lentil bulk. If so, an ant missing a limb should likewise not have the status of a whole creature. So Rav Shemaiah said in refutation of this argument, when we require the above amount, that if it is not the volume of a lentil bulk, it does not impart impurity, the requirement applies only in a case where the creature does not have a living soul before it grows to the size of a lentil. However, if it does have a soul, this volume is not required. If the creature can survive, perhaps it does impart impurity, even if it is lacking a limb. Consequently, with regard to an ant that is missing a limb, the dilemma remains unresolved for you. What is the law about this? If someone eats a forbidden creature in its entirety, for example, if he eats an ant, he is liable to receive lashes regardless of the size of the ant. However, if it is missing even a leg, he is liable only if he ate the amount of an olive bulk. And this is because the Gemara's dilemma is left unresolved, and the court does not administer lashes in a case of uncertainty. Now we return to the subject of our Mishna. What is it that a Nazir touches that he becomes impure for the dead? So the Mishnah taught that a Nazir must shave for impurity imparted by a spine and a skull. So a dilemma was raised before the sages. Did we learn a spine and skull together? Or perhaps the Mishnah means either a spine or a skull? Does the conjunctive vav, right, we use and, we just add a vav to the next word as a prefix, and that signifies the two things are linked with an and. So does the conjunctive vav signify and or, right? Is it you need both together, a spine and a skull? And if the Nazir comes into contact with that, he has become impure for the dead? Or is it just either a spine or a skull? So Rava said, come in here a resolution from a Baraisa. In the case of a spine, the majority of whose ribs were removed while the spine itself remained intact, it is ritually pure. That is not a corpse. And if it wasn't a grave, even if it was broken or disassembled, then it is impure. It is considered a corpse that imparts corpse impurity due to the grave, which joins all the bones together. Now, the Gemara infers from this Baraisa, the reason it is ritually pure in the first case is due to the fact that the ribs were removed, from which it may be inferred that if the ribs were not removed, it is impure on its own, even without the skull. So learn from this that the Mishnah teaches either a spine or a skull. Right? Isn't that Hamlet? Right? He holds up a skull. Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him well. He's holding a skull in his hand. Corpse impurity. But the Gemara rejects this claim. No, the Baraisa does not teach this explicitly. It does not state that if the ribs were not removed, the spine imparts ritual impurity by itself. Rather, the Baraisa teaches us this, that if the ribs were removed, the spine is pure. And as to the other issue, the impurity of a spine on its own, that dilemma remains unresolved for you. So the Gemara further suggests, come in here a resolution from the Tosefta. Rabbi Yehuda says that Rabbi Akiva deems 6 items impure that the rabbis deem pure, right? Pure means it does not impart corpse impurity. Impure means that it does. And Rabbi Akiva later retracted his opinion And an incident occurred in which they brought a box that was full of bones to the synagogue of the blacksmiths. And they placed it in an open airspace. The synagogue of blacksmiths, it's not relevant that they're blacksmiths to this area of law. It was just, that's the synagogue that we're talking about. And they placed it in an open airspace, not under the roof, so that it would not impart ritual impurity. And Todos, the doctor, Todos, it's spelled like todos, right? Like everyone in Spanish, Todos. But Todos is actually a diminutive form of the name Theodorus. And I just learned that Theodorus, that's Greek, right? Theodore in English, is the same name as Matisyahu. I would not have known that. And anyway, and Todos the doctor entered, and all the other doctors entered with him, and they said, after examining the pile, there is not a full spine from one corpse here. So the Gemara infers from this incident. The reason it is ritually pure is due to the fact that there was no spine from one corpse, from which one can infer that if there is either a spine or a skull from one corpse, a Nazir must shave due to it. But if it was just a collection of bones, even if they add up to a whole spine, but not a whole spine from one person, so then if you touch that, that's not going to impart corpse impurity. And a Nazir does not need to shave because of it, right? Because it's not a whole spine. It's certainly not a whole corpse, and it's not even a whole spine from a single person. But the Gemara rejects this argument. The Tana of the Baraisa is speaking, utilizing the style of, it is not necessary. Like this. It is not necessary to state that there is no spine and skull from one corpse in the box, but even the remains of either a spine from one corpse or a skull from one corpse, which together impart impurity, is not present. Instead, there are parts of spines and skulls from several bodies, and so this does not impart impurity. Now, there's also heavy impurity and lighter impurity, right? Where if you just touch these bones, maybe you are impure, but they will not impart ritual impurity through a tent, right? Being in the same room with them. Here in that synagogue, they're talking about they kept it in the open air so that people wouldn't be under the same roof with that box of bones. But then they said, there's not a complete spine from one person here, not a complete skull from one person here. So all we know for sure is that that if it did have a complete, what it seems to imply is that if you had a complete skull or if you had a complete spine, it would impart impurity even through a tent. Touching is a different question. Probably you're going to get corpse impurity even from touching this partial corpse. Now the Gemara further suggests, come and hear from the tally in the above Baraisa, right? They said there were 6 cases where Akiva disagreed with the rabbis and later he retracted. And what are those 6 items that Rabbi Akiva deems ritually impure, which the rabbis deem ritually pure? They consist of a limb from a corpse that comes from, i.e. is combined with, 2 corpses, and a severed limb from a living person that comes from 2 living people, and a half kav of bones that come from 2 corpses, and a quarter lug of blood that comes from 2 corpses, and of a bone that is a barley grain bulk, even from one body, that was divided into 2, and the spine and the skull from 2 different corpses. In all these cases, Akiva at one time said that imparts impurity. The sages said no, it doesn't, and Akiva later retracted. Now we're on 52b. And if it enters your mind that the law applies to either a spine or a skull, and they are 2 separate laws, well, then these are 7 cases rather than 6. But the Gemara rejects this claim. No proof can be brought from here, as when the Tana teaches this tally, he lists 7 items. However, only 6 are fully relevant here, and therefore he said they were 6. So the Gemara inserts a mnemonic device for the ensuing suggestions as to which item in the list is not necessary in our context. An individual disagrees with him that he shaves for it and 1/4 log. That's just a series of words that in Hebrew makes more sense as a memory device. Now, the first explanation is, Rabbi Akiva listed the spine and skull as separate items, but the 6 items include anywhere that many sages disagree with him, to the exclusion of the case of a bone that is a barley grain bulk. As here, it is an individual who disagrees with Rabbi Akiva. As it is taught in a Mishna, if a bone that is a barley grain bulk was divided into 2, Rabbi Akiva deems it impure, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri deems it pure. In this case, only one sage disagrees with Akiva. And if you wish, say a different item on the list that is omitted from the tally. When he teaches 6, he includes a limb severed from a corpse, but it does not teach a limb severed from a living person, and that was the case that was not listed. Or if you wish, say a different item on the list that is omitted from the tally. When he teaches 6, he mentions anywhere that a Nazir shaves for his overlaying, meaning he formed a tent over the remains of a corpse, to the exclusion of the case of a bone that is a barley grain bulk, as it does not impart ritual impurity in a tent. As stated in the Mishna, this bone imparts impurity only through contact and carrying, not being in the same room with it. And if you wish, say a different item on the list that is omitted from the tally. When he teaches 6, he lists anywhere that Rabbi Akiva retracted his opinion to the exclusion of a quarter lug of blood, because Rabbi Akiva did not retract his opinion in that case. As Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said to Bar Kapara, do not teach a quarter lug of blood in the list of Rabbi Akiva's retractions, because Rabbi Akiva held on to his opinion in this regard. And furthermore, the verse supports his opinion as it states, neither shall he go into any dead bodies, Leviticus 21:11, and the plural form bodies indicates that two corpses can join together as stated by Rabbi Akiva. Similarly, Rabbi Shimon says, all his days, Rabbi Akiva would deem a quarter lug of blood from 2 corpses ritually impure. Whether he retracted his opinion after he died, this I do not know. A sage taught Rabbi Shimon's teeth blackened due to his fasts, which he undertook for uttering this irreverent comment about Rabbi Akiva. And that concludes that part of the discussion. Now the Gemara returns to the earlier discussion. Come in here and answer to the question of whether a spine and a skull must be together to impart ritual impurity, right? That's still the open question. Does a Nazir shave, right, become impure for the dead and shave and restart his Naziris if, I'm not sure if he comes into contact with or is even a tent with a skull or a spine, or is it that it needs to be a skull and the spine to trigger that resetting of his Naziris? So come in here and answer to this question, as it is taught in a Mishnah, that Beis Shammai say the quarter kav of bones, which imparts impurity in a tent, can be from several bones, or from 2 or from 3 bones, but they cannot be from 1 bone. And Beis Hillel say the quarter kav of bones must come from the same body, either from the majority of the structure of the skeleton or from the majority of the number of the 248 bones in the body. And Rabbi Yehoshua said, I can establish the statement of Beis Shammai and the statement of Beis Hillel as one. In other words, I can explain their opinions so that there is no dispute between them. How so? As when Beis Shammai say, from 2 or 3 bones, they mean either from 2 shins and 1 thigh or from 2 thighs and 1 shin. Since the majority of a person's height is contained in the height of these limbs, those are the longest bones in the body, they are considered the majority of the structure of the body. And Beis Hillel say parts from the body or from the majority of the structure or from the majority of the number of bones, since they include the joints of the hands and feet, which comprise many small bones, these impart impurity. Shammai says even a bone from the spine or from the skull imparts impurity. Now in this source, which is the reason we're bringing it here, Shammai explicitly refers to a spine or a skull. But the Gemara rejects this proof. One cannot establish a general law from this source, for Shammai is different, as he is invariably stringent, whereas the rabbis might disagree. So the Gemara inquires, and I'm almost done, so you got questions or comments, get them in. The Gemara, from which it may be inferred that according to the rabbis, a spine and skull are not ritually impure unless both a spine and a skull are present. But the Gemara rejects this proof also. No, the rabbis disagree with Shammai only with regard to 1 bone that comes from the spine or from the skull. But when it is intact, even if the bone is from one of them, either the spine or the skull, they might agree that it imparts impurity. So we haven't resolved it just from reading the Gemara. What is the halakha? A whole spine or a whole skull, right? This is from Sefer Hafla, but it's given as a halakhic note here in the margin of the Koran Talmud. A whole spine or a whole skull impart impurity by contact, carrying, and in a tent, like an intact corpse, right? So a whole skull or a whole spine, you don't need both. they are going to impart impurity like it's the whole corpse. And a Nazir must shave if he is rendered impure by them, right? By contact, by carrying it, even if you're not, like, even if it's in a bag and you carry the bag, you didn't touch the spine or the skull, but if you caused it to move, you carried it, that's corpse impurity. The same as if you touched a corpse. That applies to a spine or a skull. And even if you're in the same room with a spine or a skull, you have contracted corpse impurity, and you have to go through that 7-day purification if you want to continue your vow of Naziris, because you had one and you need to do this, or if you want to enter the temple when the temple is standing, you're going to have to go through that 7-day purification first. And so that is the law. Although this dilemma is left unresolved by the Gemara, Shammai clearly rules in this manner, and the wording of the Mishnah indicates likewise. Furthermore, the Gemara goes to great lengths to substantiate this opinion, and that is why later sages concluded that that is the law, and that's the law. Okay, let's go to questions or comments. On Nazir 52. Paula, even a convert? Does a convert Nazir have to do Mace Mitzvah? I.e., what if Nazir's parent isn't Jewish? I don't think that's relevant at all. Whether you're a convert or born a Jew, you can take an oath of Naziris, and then you're a Nazir. In terms of the obligation to bury the unattended corpse, that's incumbent on every Jew. Makes no difference whether you were born a Jew or converted. I think what you're asking about is for your parent, right? So I mean, I think that the Nazir is not permitted to become impure for the dead, even for parents. And are you saying that, does that include a convert Nazir that is not allowed to become impure even for their father? But what if their father wasn't a Jew? I think it doesn't matter. I think the point is you can't become impure for the dead if you're a Nazir, even for a parent. You do it for a Mace Mitzvah. That's an unattended corpse, and now it doesn't matter. Okay, maybe this is what you're asking. The Mace Mitzvah obligation is to bury an unattended corpse of a Jew. Right? And so if it's not a Jew, it's not the same obligation. It's not the same obligation. And that just, if the corpse is not a Jew, the corpse is not a Jew. That's my understanding. Bill, this spine and skull versus spine or skull is all to ask, can a Nazir play Hamlet? Just so. Bill Eldridge, yeah. And so the answer we've discovered is no. A Nazir cannot play Hamlet. Bill, yes. Both Theodorus, Theodore, and Matisyahu, Matthew mean gift of God. Theos translates as God, naturally, and Doros means gift. Funnily enough, Dorothy, Dorothea, or Dorotheos is the feminine form. Theodora comes later. That's so interesting. So Dorothy is the same name as Theodore, and both mean gift from God. Thank you for illuminating that for me. Sharon, this sounds pretty awful, but if we cannot tell parts from one another, what is the status of bones in a mass grave or the remains from a crematorium? Obviously, my concern is from Shoah remains. Right. I mean, I don't know. I would suggest that, first of all, we're talking about the Nazir, and the Kohen Gadol is prohibited from coming into contact with these. Anyone else, I mean, you become impure for the dead, but so what, right? If the Mashiach comes and the third temple goes up today, okay, we're going to have to go through a 7-day purification before we can enter the temple. But there's no restriction on us to handle those remains, right? So, it would certainly be befitting that if we come into contact, with human remains, that we do anything that we can for the dignity of those remains. And that, I believe, is for a Jew or a non-Jew, right? Anytime we come into contact, we have an opportunity to make sure that human remains are treated respectfully and buried properly. We do it, even if it means handling those remains. If you're a Cohen, Okay, so that's a different law. So the Kohen is not permitted to do that except for his family. But, it would seem, reading from this, that if it's, just parts of bones, and we have strong reason to believe that there's mixture here of different people. So like Sharon is talking about, when they find mass graves of Jews that were killed in the Holocaust. What was the gentleman's name? Father, this wonderful, wonderful Catholic priest. We interviewed him on our show. I just can't remember his name right now, French priest, but he has made a lifetime work of uncovering these mass graves that the Nazis created. And he calls it the Holocaust by bullets. And these deaths were, Father Dubois, is typing out, these deaths were grossly underreported, right? So when we talk about that the 6 million died, and a lot of that was in concentration camps, but the number is actually larger because there were so many Jews that were just walked to, the Nazis dug a pit, they put a bunch of Jews in front of it, firing squad shot them, threw them in the hole, and then covered them up. And I mean, it's just horrific to even think about, but often people went into that hole who had been shot but survived the shooting and then were buried alive. And sometimes those people escaped, right? They fell in, either they were shot and not terribly injured, or they pretended to be shot and they just went in. And then later when the Nazis left and before there was so much dirt that they couldn't escape, people crawled out of those holes and escaped. But it's thought, but Father Dubois told us that something like 1 million Jews died in that manner. It's just too awful to contemplate. And finally, slightly off topic, Sam Richardson says, I was at a graveside funeral on Sunday. Strangely, there was no hand-washing station at the entrance and exit of this rather large and old Jewish cemetery. What is the law of washing when the opportunity is not immediately available? What a great question. I don't know the answer offhand. I would think it's a ritual washing. You're not going to come into contact with anything that it's really going to affect anyway. So probably you wash your hands at the next opportunity. But I would ask a rabbi or Google the question. I'm not sure. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together tomorrow, Friday, the regular Friday time, which is noon Pacific.